Living in Virginia, you're in the fast lane on the information superhighway. We've invested $3 billion in Virginia's broadband network to give you one of the fastest internet connection speeds in the world, so you can build relationships, bring new business to our state, and meet the future of education. It's amazing what we can do together. Visit VCTA.com to learn how broadband connects the Commonwealth.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the VCTA Broadband Association and Comcast, connecting Virginians to their government. We're pleased to have Senator Jeremy McPike with us this morning. Good to see you, sir.
Good morning. It's great to be here, Woody. Thanks for having me.
Lots of people in the halls these days, and I know you're busy already. How are things going so far?
Well, it's I think when you have a transition of power like we've had in the General Assembly, we're working through, obviously the committee assignments are now set, the new structure in place in both chambers, and we're really setting out for a lot of the vision that we've talked about to the voters over the last couple of years, whether it be improving environmental efforts, whether it be improving our schools. You saw some of the governor's budget with school counselors, pre-K education. These are really key things that last a generation. I think you'll see this year a lot of the renewable energy bills as well. The governor set out a goal of 2050 in terms of renewable energy and reducing our carbon footprint. These are things that I think as Virginia looks at our natural resources, whether it be the Chesapeake Bay, so many other critical and important things, we're starting to make some real movement on these, which have been languishing for years.
Now, what about your district? How are things going back home, so to speak?
Well, my district is Prince William County, Manassas and Manassas Park. And so I have Interstate 95 on the east side and 66. So anytime you're in my district, you got to talk about traffic and transportation. And this year we saw the governor's announcements on the CSX deal for the Long Bridge. And this is the major bottleneck of the rail lines, both the Fredericksburg line as well as the Manassas lines that sort of all come together as we cross into DC, and that's called the Long Bridge. And so adding additional capacity is just such a major initiative for the entire East Coast. But for my district, it's also about commuter rail. We have both lines in Woodbridge to Fredericksburg, as well as the Manassas line. And we can put more people on the VRE system than adding more lanes and more roads. And we know that's always just troublesome. It's extraordinarily expensive. And whenever we add a new road, it seems like they fill up just as quickly as we add a new lane. And so really the long-term solution is starting to deal with the commuter rail and finally seeing some progress there. It's going to be a massive project, but so important for the region's economy.
So if people gotten used to the hot lanes, I assume they still complain about the tolls.
Yeah, that's a tough one. For years I also slugged, which is picking up riders and riding on the HOV lanes for free. That still exists with the hot lanes. Certainly for 66, people don't like the high toll because that's a limited lane where you don't have general access inside the Beltway. And so, getting a handle on the different forms and routes that we can commute, as well as hopefully doing better land use and planning around transportation nodes is so important. So it can be multimodal, give you options, whether it be metro, VRE, or slugging and commuting in with other riders.
Now, what about smart scale? Has it worked for your constituency?
I think there's some level of criticism. Certainly the metro deal from several years ago, we didn't necessarily like it. We had to pass a portion of it to make sure there was revenue going to metro to do some of the major capital fixes. Hopefully we're going to address that, because that bill a couple years ago took money away from the region's transportation to fix metro. We had a proposal that would have really had additional revenue coming from the metro station areas, whether it be hotel occupancy tax and a few other things. So we want to restore that funding. make sure we still have a huge backlog of need throughout the region, of course across the Commonwealth as well. But I think the smart scale has helped mitigate congestion relief in some critical areas. Unfortunately, we're behind billions of dollars. I mean, even the 2013 deal, I think folks recognize that it really just scratches the surface of what we need to do.
And of course, we have more fuel-efficient vehicles. We have electric vehicles. The gas tax isn't keeping up with the need for additional revenues.
That's right. I'm guilty as well, by the way. I have a hybrid, electric and gas, and that changes the dynamic. You have a lot more drivers doing that, and so the declining revenues from a long-term perspective isn't sustainable. And so we do have to figure out and roll up our sleeves and find out the long-term sustainable funding that's going to continue to support the Commonwealth's infrastructure.
Is there a competitive disadvantage that some localities have because they aren't able to impose a tax, which gives you a little bit more leverage in terms of smart scale?
So one of the pieces I think many of us are trying to address is the difference between cities and counties taxation. In fact, Senator Hanger, we had a bill up in committee that's referred to finance now that would sort of level some of the playing field between cities and counties. And I think over the last couple of years, we've seen different localities in some fiscal distress. And in fairness, we also haven't given them the same tools to work with as a Dillon Rule state. And so I think there's some recognition amongst the members that we've got to start to address this issue.
Now, you talked about new leadership. What's happening on the Senate side? You have a new majority leader. You have people who are chairing committees, especially women who weren't involved in leadership positions. And of course, in the House, you have big changes.
That's right. Well, Dick Saslaw is our majority leader, and Mamie Locke is our chair of our caucus. So we have, and also Luis Lucas, serving as the Senate pro tempore. So we have some historic firsts in Virginia, seeing these women step up in major leadership roles, not only representing their districts, but representing the Commonwealth. So it's an exciting time to see them step up and start to be a voice for all Virginians.
It looks like the Equal Rights Amendment will make it out of the Senate again.
Yes. That's, as you know, it's passed, with fairly decent margins in the Senate, and so we look forward to seeing that come out and move on its way and get over to the House and move on as the 38th state to ratify it.
Let's take advantage of some of your background and expertise in terms of emergency services, especially firefighters, and their ability to take advantage of workers' comp when they are injured or when they are susceptible to certain diseases. I know you have some legislation dealing with those issues.
Yeah, in fact, yesterday we had a bill modifying our cancer presumption law in Virginia. My background, as you said, I've about 20 years of service in fire and EMS, and unfortunately the firefighters get exposed, whether on a car fire or house fire. The gear that you wear still seeps into your skin in terms of the toxins, the smoke that gets emitted during those fires. And unfortunately, you still have a Nomex hood, but all that breathes, and so you sweat and you get all these substances on your body, and you're working on a scene sometimes for hours and hours with these chemicals, unfortunately, that are direct contact with your skin. Even though we're protecting our respiratory system, the rest of the body gets exposed. And so this year we've got some language that modifies and cleans up some of the cancer presumption. We also add testicular cancer, brain cancer, and colon cancer.
So those would be presumptively compensable under those changes.
That's right. And NIOSH, OSHA have looked at cancer rates among those cancers in firefighters, and there's a much higher rate than the general population for these covered cancers. And frankly, we have first responders, we want to make sure they're also covered for doing what they do day in and day out. And Virginia's fallen a little short the last couple of years, and so I think we've got a great chance to pass this to help our first responders this year finally.
What's the process if someone is injured or is it unfortunate enough to contract a disease like that?
So what they have to do is first off establish, right now it's 12 years, and it has to be continuous service. 12 years? Yes. We're changing that to 5 years, and we're taking out the continuous service. because people could change fire departments. Once that happened, they would break service. They have to reset the clock. All sorts of complications, unfortunately, and that has denied people coverage. So we're fixing that. And so if you come down with one of the presumed cancers, you have to provide your record of service. You have to provide specific events. And under the previous law, you had to have to list the actual chemicals that you're exposed to. Now,
Wow.
what do you know? You and I know
Yes.
that any house or any condition, you don't have the entire, it's impossible to figure out what's burning and what that chemical reaction in that fire makes. And so the standard is almost ridiculous, and we're also changing that. If we're going to do a presumptive law, let's make it presumptive. Let's not have the firefighters and their families have to fight for years trying to prove each and every element of the service and how they were exposed. And so we're working to correct that as well. And so it's tough because a lot of times they get denied first off. They got to get an attorney and then go through the fight while suffering a lot of times life threatening. And I've lost several friends in the service over time as
Sure.
well to these cancers. And it's tough to see what they go through. And
Is the compensation adequate to take care of hospital expenses and things of that nature?
it's really not. We had a tough case with pancreatic cancer is also one of the presumed ones. Kevin Fry passed away about 2 years ago. His family had to settle for $15,000. He literally held out till the final hours of his life. I called his wife up. I talked to the comptroller to make sure he was approved, and it was also covered for line of duty death. And reached out to his wife. He passed away 4 hours later.
Wow.
I mean, I think he was literally holding on to make sure his family was covered for his years of service to the community. So those are real stories that happen, unfortunately, all over the Commonwealth. So it's not unique, and it's tough to see how much blockade we put to actually helping the
Sure.
people that have helped us for years.
And how is workers' comp funded? Is that part of an employer's responsibility as well?
It is. And so they pay into a pool. They also have additional insurance umbrellas over it as well. So when that occurs, they're sort of set up to lawyer up, unfortunately, to deny. Getting through all the medical paperwork, everything else is fairly tough, and it does take a lot of time. There's some long-term efforts we're looking at ways to streamline it. Colorado has a model which they, once you prove you've been in the service, once you prove you have a cancer, you get sent a check. And sort of it's a tiered payout system that we're starting to explore. JLARC had just done a study that helped us give the framework of the legislative changes we're doing this year.
That's the joint legislative.
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
That's all right.
We all get an
I
alphabet
know.
soup, right? But the joint legislative review was very helpful, and they also identified some other examples across the United States that may help Virginians in this sort of predicament.
It's interesting you mentioned that. Unfortunately, lawyers are still involved in the process because workers' comp, as I understand it, was set up in order to protect employers from being sued by their employees.
Right. It's still very much that way, not just for the presumption laws, but for many other. It's unfortunately having to deal with constituent issues where you see this come up, and a lot of frustration to say, haven't I been helping to pay into this? And I get my back thrown out on a job, and now I'm suffering. Injuries last a lifetime, and a lot of these things take years and years, and you have to have an attorney to really make sure that you and your family are protected.
Sure. Electric utility legislation, I know you have something regarding that as well.
Yeah, so put in this year with Delegate Mike Mullen, the Energy Choice Act. What we're trying to do is to make sure that folks can aggregate, like at the 5 megawatt, some of the large consumers, and have some options for renewable energy. I think one of the most important things we can do is to create markets where we have large companies now, demanding Costco, Walmart, Facebook.
Right.
They know that their consumers want them to be responsible in how they also act and purchase energy. And so Virginia's framework has been very, very slow to respond to that market demand. And so this will start to free up some opportunities. So folks can pick if they want wind, they can buy wind. If they want solar, they can buy solar. If they want a hybrid mix, they can do that as well. And right now, unfortunately, our regulatory framework is fairly stymied. So we want to open up a couple of code sections to give more choice.
And of course, you've got Amazon
That's right.
up in Northern Virginia your way now, so they're going to want to do the same thing, I assume.
That's right. It's just more and more, and I think as more and more of these big companies start to drive the industry in terms of what they want, that also helps all the other consumers.
It does.
You know, you've got to create demand and market. Now we've got to deal with the supply. And so the price point for solar has dropped so much in the last, I remember, 15 years ago, and the price point was like, it's a little expensive, it's the right thing to do. But now, frankly, just the cost for solar panels in the market has dropped so significantly. And you see the ability to mass produce that resource as well.
Right.
It's pretty impressive.
So this would encourage retail competition with those large employers then,
That's right.
being able to purchase renewable energy in essence.
That's right.
Okay. Child daycare programs. What's going on with that?
So a couple things I've been working on over the last couple of years is lead water testing. I passed in 2017 the first lead water testing standard for our schools, and since that time, I think the perception was our water's fine. We've had the Lead Water Act and federally, and I think people didn't realize that dealt with the water distribution system, but not from when the water gets into the buildings. And so since 2017, there have been school systems that have finally been testing, and they've found thousands of results that are above EPA lead water levels, unfortunately. So this would also apply the same testing requirement to our daycare centers. And so, as you know, lead impacts disproportionately children when they're developing, and having, unfortunately, I don't think any parent wants, water that's contaminated with lead being added to their kids' formula, right? But theoretically, we don't know yet until we test.
Sure.
And I think part of it's educating, making sure people understand how to maintain their own faucets, water systems. Sometimes it's just the filter within the faucet itself that's collected. Changing that out, a couple dollar part, actually helps to improve the water quality, and just helping to clean up our system. So I've got some budget amendments too I'm working on to help provide some additional funds for the Virginia Department of Health's drinking water division on supporting testing efforts across Virginia.
How do those budget amendments work? I mean, there is a budget. Obviously, this would be a change to the budget that the governor has submitted.
That's right. So last week was our budget submission deadline on Friday. This week, they're all getting collected and finalized with Senate Finance and obviously over in the House Appropriations. So they'll go through a process of whether they make the cut or not. And so there'll be hundreds and hundreds of budget amendments all across each of the senators. And those will be reviewed by Senate Finance, both staff and the committee. And if they're approved, they'll be consolidated with the House version and mashed out through the conference report. So,
alcohol beverage control.
yes,
I believe you have some legislation dealing with that agency that produces quite a bit of revenue.
it does. So we've had a bipartisan subcommittee that's been working over the last 3 years. We've just passed an omnibus bill out of Rehab and Social Services Committee where all the ABC laws are reviewed in the Senate to reduce the number of permits. Since Prohibition, I think we started with 12 permit types. And since that time, we've sort of ballooned to over 120 or so different permits and licenses. And so we're consolidating that bucket, each of those sort of bucket to like a marketplace license, different things. I don't think after Prohibition, we really conceived things like a Wegmans that can serve like a restaurant. It also can, you can buy your own pack of beer and take it home with you. And so it's really just thinking about how the marketplace has changed, revising it, making it a lot simpler for people to understand what permit or license they need, and cleaning up our code section.
Is that a long-term project, you think, or is that something that can be easily done?
And so we've spent the last 3 years working on it. So we've got about a 125-page bill. I think we've gotten consolidation, a lot of alignment that's sort of been muddied up over the years, what we call Christmas tree bills, slight and small add-ons to legislation. And I think we've got consensus both in the House and the Senate and industry stakeholders as well.
something a little bit more complicated probably, but something that's also been under study for a number of years is reforming our tax code. Because there are a lot of tax credits and other things that businesses, large and small, individuals, rich, not so rich, are able to take advantage of. And I know there's been talk about reforming that, but I take it that's something that is a much longer term project.
That is. There is some interest. There are tax credits that we need to review their effectiveness to all of Virginia as a whole. And I think there's some probably things that have been on the book for some time that maybe don't quite hit the mark. And it is going to take some time to work through, making sure that we also don't cause harm.
Yes.
Anytime you do those shifts, there's some sometimes alternate reactions that you didn't necessarily anticipate.
Right. Unintended consequences.
Unintended consequence. Thank you.
Exactly. The other big ticket item this year, of course, will be redistricting. And of course, last year the Assembly passed a resolution that has to be passed without significant change again this year before it goes to the voters. There's been a lot of gnashing of teeth by some people who are concerned about what they voted for last year. How do you see that turning out?
Yeah, I think there is, we're at the final stage now. We have to pass it again, and then it'll be on the ballot in November. And so this is, I think, a critically important decision. I've been supportive of it for years. I was the Northern Virginia chair for One Virginia 2021, almost, 8-10 years ago. But getting the mechanism right is important because we're talking about the future representation of all of Virginians. And so I think it's going to come down to working through the criteria bill, and the criteria bill sort of highlights the process to go through legislatively when the redistricting process happens. And there's so many different variables. We have, if you look at compactness criteria, right, one of the issues is a lot of the counties, we were built in these invisible lines that we've drawn in political boundaries were many times drawn sometimes based on racial divisions within communities, but also a lot of the counties were drawn based on a horse ride to the courthouse, right? In our day and age of communities of interest, you see built upon commuting patterns, roadways, sometimes mountains and other things. So it does get very detailed and complex and nuanced when you start to look through what representation should look like, taking into account certainly minority representation, economic representation, all sorts of diverse issues to make sure that everyone has a voice at the table.
Now, how does this commission work as it's currently set up under the resolution? There's a 16-person commission that's appointed by whom?
That's right. So you'll have House members, Senate members, then you'll have independent retired judges theoretically that would form the commission to help draw. They have to draw based on the criteria we also give them.
And that criteria would have to be set forth in a separate statute?
That's right.
Okay.
And so that's why when I talk about the criteria bill,
Yes.
that is the sort of the statute that's being debated right now and trying to make sure that we've got the right framework and lens for them to look at. And certainly, I think everybody that's involved, wants to see fair representation. I don't think, picking the winners and losers before voters get to pick them is, a great context.
Sure.
And certainly, gerrymandering has been in place for...
You're the first person who has pronounced that correctly. It was Gary, not Jerry.
It was Gary. But that's right. But, it has been in place for years, for centuries. And I think the difference today is that we have computers that can literally, and you've seen it in the last couple of maps, split neighborhoods right down the middle. And that's tough when you literally walk across the street and you're in a different district. And sometimes those streets are split the other way too. And so you've got a crossroads of different districts. And it's because the computer system now can so finely pinpoint at least the voting proclivity of a neighborhood as to sway future elections. And that's a little tough to reconcile when we want to create a framework of fair elections. So those are tough to reconcile, and hopefully we can do a better job.
Now, the 16-person commission, how many of those members would have to agree to a plan?
Oh, it's quiz time in the morning. So you have to have also a bipartisan, so you do have to have some Republicans come over as well, or Democrats, to make it all work. And so in theory, there would have to be some bipartisan agreement for this to move forward. And so that's sort of the theory behind it, is you couldn't necessarily push one way or the other. The other theory is maybe it fails and it gets thrown to the Supreme Court. And that worries some folks as well, that you'd have the court drawing the maps anyway. Maybe that's a good thing. I don't know. We'll see how it plays out.
So what are some of the things you really liked from the governor's State of the Commonwealth address? We talked about additional revenues for schools early on, but there are obviously a lot of other things.
We did. He certainly emphasized and hit some of the environmental work that he's doing, but also one of the key things he talked about was our labor laws in Virginia. One of the bills I'm carrying is worker misclassification. Unfortunately, we have folks that, especially in the construction trades, are not paying, are treating employees as 1099. They're not paying the taxes.
Independent contractors.
Yep, and the contractors as independent contractors, when they're really being directed and under labor laws, they're an employee. And so they're skipping out on all the other taxes that businesses pay. It's not fair. We've got to level the playing field, and Virginia has been very lax over the last couple of years. We got to do a better job in this, and there's going to be some provisions that help the enforcement side of it. Unfortunately, you got companies that flip, they close down, they set up the next day as a new corporation, and so you have these bad actors that are really sort of using labor out there as sort of a labor mill, in and out as independent contractors when they're clearly not. They don't meet any of the standards. And in those circumstances, you get folks that get a low bid on a job, but really they're cheating out the company who is doing the right thing. So there's an unfair, illegal activity that is flying under the radar, and we've got to help clean it up.
We've got about a minute and a half left, but I want to give you an opportunity to tell your constituents what success will mean for you at the end of the session.
Well, I think success is, overall looking at the improvements to our schools, our funding for our transportation. Right now, we've got a fantastic amount of innovation happening in our district with Micron's, $3 billion expansions going on right now in Manassas. We've got our George Mason Science and Tech campus, so I'm working on an additional engineering building, getting some planning money in the budget. So we work through that and get that. We're going to continue to expand our STEM impact in the community. And really seeing the investment in our education. We talked about earlier, our school counselors, something we started with last year, really expanding that universe. Laying those foundations are important. Our kids are the next generation, so whether it be pre-K education all the way through our community college system, the governor's proposed some really neat incentives there on our community college system. We'll see how it works out in the budget this year. But
great. Senator Jeremy McPike, good to see you.
Thank you so much, Woody.
Thanks for watching Cable Reports. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans.
Mm-hmm.